Hopefully the sound quality works out here. I am not going to practice this and do it again and again, so if I stumble over some things, you'll have to forgive me. I made the mistake in the spring of trying to record totally perfect PowerPoint presentations with microphone and everything, and it took a million years, and I'm not even sure more than half the class ever watched them, which is fine, but whatever. So this week, we are looking at the visual aspect. We're only going to spend 1 week on it for a variety of reasons. But we're going to include two kinds of things in this visual week. One is painting, but the other is literature. The passage that you have this week is from Virginia Woolf, the English novelist who wrote in the beginning of the 20th century, specifically the novel Mrs. Dalloway, arguably her most famous. That and To the Lighthouse are the ones that usually get cited. She was one of the pioneers for stream of consciousness narration, which the first time I read it, I thought, this is really difficult. I'm not sure I like this, right? One of the things that helped me gain some kind of perspective on what was happening was when I read an article talking about the impact of Cubist art on one of Virginia Woolf's contemporaries, William Faulkner, the American novelist. And then certain things came into focus, and I started going, oh, I see, that's kind of what they're doing. Now that's kind of interesting. You may not still like it, but the goal of this presentation is to give you an angle on it so that you can appreciate what Virginia Woolf is trying to do in the passage that I gave you. So this little presentation is called The Road to Cubism, and we're going to look at some of the things that led up to the beginning of this art movement in the 20th century, and specifically how the weirder side of art came about. I don't know if you've ever wondered this, looking at some of the more abstract paintings. We've all at some point wondered, why would someone paint this way? You know, you don't want to paint a book or something that someone can recognize. You just want to throw stuff on a canvas. Like, where did this come from? Well, this is supposed to illustrate sort of where this came from. Okay, now we're going to be looking at France in particular because the hinge point for Cubism is Impressionism, which is a French movement. Now, in the early 20th century, if you wanted to be an artist, you had to go through the Académie des Beaux-Arts, or the Fine Arts Academy. That was it. A lot of things are very formalized in France, even now. Like, this is a baguette. What you just made is not a baguette. It has to obey certain sort of baking rules. And if you wanted your stuff to be noticed, you had to go through one of the annual salons for the Académie des Beaux-Arts. Now, beginning of the 19th century in France, here's what the visual art sort of looked like. This is The Raft of the Medusa, La Balsa de la Medusa, by Jean-Louis Théodore Géricault. Very, very famous. It's a very large painting. If you're ever in Paris and you have a chance to go to the Louvre, you'll see. It's just massive. Based on a real historical event, if you care to study it sometime, it has a very interesting geometry to it. It effectively has two interlocking pyramids, which you can see from the sail mast and the guy waving the flag in the top right. That's one very famous painting. Here's another. Possibly the most recognizable painting, at least in France, from the 19th century. Eugène Delacroix, which is Liberty Guiding the People, La Liberté Guidant le Peuple, which was painted about the 1930 uprising that got rid of the monarch at the time. I would say his name, but frankly, I forget off the top of my head, and you're not going to know who it is anyway. But effectively, it was an uprising. There were a number of uprisings in France, beginning with the French Revolution, that sort of swung back and forth between establishing a monarch, overthrowing a monarch, and issuing in a republic. This happened a few times. And in this particular one, it's meant to illustrate, obviously, the revolutionary fervor of the people. Many, 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 many writings have been done about who exactly Marianne, who's the woman in the middle, was. Was it just a figment of Delacroix's imagination? Does she represent just the nation? Why can we see her breast? What does that have to do with anything? A lot of symbolism in this painting. But even now, her sort of cap and her hair, the way she looks off to the side, that's the official symbol, just the head, not obviously the breasts, of many, many French legal documents and official things You'll see her face on Made in France symbols. She's the symbol, right? But this is what painting kind of looked like. Historical scenes, uplifting moments, mythology, rendered in great detail. You can see the musculature here. Here you can see as well as facial expressions and many things that you could easily trace to real people. So, how did we go from those paintings to Claude Monet's Water Lilies? All right. And then this is kind of a bad capture of a larger painting. Pablo Picasso's Girl with a Mandolin in 1910. So the first Impressionist exhibition where they get their name was in 1874 when there was an exhibition of what they were just called refused paintings, paintings that were not allowed into the annual salon, and the artists were like, all right, well fine, we don't need you, we're just going to have our own thing. We went from that, right, this is a little later than that, but it's a similar style, right, to this in 35 years. Now, we live in an age when things change very, very quickly. I listen to tons of music, possibly too much music, but we listened to jazz earlier in the term. Jazz went from swing, which, even if you don't like it, is very, very, very accessible, to completely atonal free jazz in about 40 years, roughly the same amount of time, which is completely bananas. Now, to put that in perspective, let's look at two paintings, two works separated by almost 300 years. The left is, I shouldn't have to tell you what the left is, Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. Napoleon Crossing the Alps in 1801 by, if memory serves, Jacques-Louis David, who painted the, I believe this one. No, that's de la Croix. I'm stupid. Anyway, Jacques-Louis David painted Napoleon Crossing the Alps. Anyway, nearly 300 years goes by. Now, you can obviously see a difference. They're not the same styles, but they're still attempting to do the same thing, right? There's an almost photorealistic aspect of both paintings. Both are trying to depict the thing as it must have looked. Anyone can look at it and go, oh, I see, on the left, this is clearly a noblewoman that Leonardo da Vinci was painting. On the right, that's obviously, even if you don't know who Napoleon was, a guy charging into battle, clearly, right? Now, why the change? Arguably, there were changes that happened in the 19th century that had never been seen in history. First, science, and second, photography. Now, obviously, they're kind of intertwined. Now, does that mean science didn't exist before the 19th century? Absolutely not. But science becomes a codified method, a thing, really, in the 19th century. The term scientist is created in the 1830s. Before that, you were just called a natural philosopher. And the scientific method, the whole manner of doing scientific research comes to maturity in the 19th century. Before that, it was kind of the wild, wild west. One of my favorite stories is the Scottish chemist, Humphrey Davy, who was renowned, gave public lectures, was immensely popular. But before he became super popular, he gained notoriety by discovering the anesthetic uses of laughing gas, laudanum. No, it's not laudanum. Anyway, nitrous oxide, that's what I'm thinking of. Now, how did he discover this? Through lots of laboratory work? No. He got a selection of gases, breathed them in himself, and had his assistants write down the effects. He discovered nitrous oxide, but he also breathed in carbon monoxide as well. The guy was nuts, right? Now, that's an example of how out there things were. By the 19th century, you have a method that starts to get into place. What we know of today is a scientific method. This leads to phenomenal discoveries. Now, I can't go through all of them, but if you want to do a Wikipedia search, you'll see them all. Electromagnetism, evolution, old Earth geology, the laws of thermodynamics, non-Euclidean geometry, telegraphy, oil refining, phonography. It just goes on. And effectively, each one of those things upends some aspect of the world people think they knew, right? Just take electromagnetism. Now, you don't think about this being all that revolutionary. But when Michael Faraday began discovering that you could generate a magnetic field using an electric current, one of the ways he discovered this was by attracting something across the room without even using a magnet. He was like, what is going on? One of the things this led to was the notion that there were fields, there were invisible things in the air itself that were propagating these effects. So that sounds like nothing now, but at the time, the idea that the air itself, which was just considered nothingness, just emptiness, contained forces, powerful forces, that we couldn't see and couldn't even control was terrifying. You know a little bit about old evolution, old Earth geology. Charles Lyell writes a book about geology demonstrating pretty conclusively that no, the Earth is actually extremely, extremely phenomenally old. Things just go on and on. People's worldviews are just being upended every few decades. One of the things that happens practically about this is that city planners, governments, etc., begin to go, you know, science is capable of explaining things in depth and bringing about results that are precise, that are measured, that do what we want them to do. Why don't we apply that to cities as well? You likely do not know who Georges Eugène Haussmann was, but the majority of what you think of Paris as Paris today is because of him. So roughly speaking, in 1853, the monarch at the time says to Haussmann, here's the thing, I want Paris to be a modern city. It's cool and everyone likes it, that's fine, but it's really old and there's lots of things that we don't like about it. There's no sewage, for example. There's not enough drinking water. The streets suck. Let's do something about that. Now, today there would be committees and best practices and all that. In the 19th century, the king just went, so, you know, here's $1 trillion, go do stuff. Have fun. And so Haussmann proceeds to tear down and rebuild most of Paris. Maybe not most, but a lot of Paris. This is a painting of some of his reforms afterwards. This is a really broad, wide street. Paris did not have big, broad, wide streets before Haussmann. Before him, you had things like this. This is not a picture you usually associate with Paris. Or these. It was pretty dingy and broken down and nasty in places. It also made it quite easy for rebels to erect barricades, and this happened many, many times, because if the street's really narrow, you really only have to stack up a little bit of trash, and it's almost impossible for people to get through. The Crown didn't want this happening anymore. Roofs like these are really famous rooftops, this sort of tight, angled roof. This was also one of Haussmann's creations. And these big, broad avenues, also Haussmann's creations. Most of the parks in Paris. One of Haussmann's goals was for every resident of Paris to be within a 15-minute walk, I believe it's 15 minutes, of a park. Anywhere in Paris. If you walk 15 minutes, you can find a park. And he accomplished it. If you're ever in Paris, or if you've ever been to Paris, you'll see it. Walk just about any direction, and within about 15 minutes, you'll pass a park. Might not be a huge one, but it'll be a park. Right? Now, this sounds great, and from the perspective of modern city planning, it was phenomenal. It provided people with clean water, better sewers, nicer parks, the whole thing. But it also required Haussmann to tear down tons of parts of Paris, and a lot of Parisians just went nuts. Victor Hugo famously left the city and refused to come back. He said, you know, the whole place looks like my least favorite street in Paris. Now, this was all down to what was considered very scientific planning. We've run the angles. Clearly, the street needs to be exactly this wide. Buildings need to be exactly this tall at exactly this angle. This left out a lot of the romance and excitement of city life for Parisians. Then there's this, the Eiffel Tower. Now we don't typically think of this as a technological marvel. When it was erected, it was a stunning scientific and technological achievement. It was the first very, very large artistic structure made entirely out of metal. No one did anything like this. Setting it up established Paris as a scientific leader, as a technological leader in the world. Again, you look at the Eiffel Tower, you don't think of it that way now, but when it was erected, that's absolutely what it was. Okay, how about photography? This is the earliest known photograph we have of, by anybody, by Louis Daguerre in 1838. The Boulevard du Temple, the Temple Boulevard. 1838, that's a long time ago. Why does this matter? Well, we looked at paintings in the early 19th century just a second ago. Very, very realistic. In fact, there's far more realistic paintings even than that. With the advent of the precision of scientific measurement and engineering, with the advent of precise photography, that you can take a picture like this and see exactly what the street looks like. Painters start to get very, very uncomfortable and go, well, so what is there exactly for us to do now? You know, we've depicted scenes from history, great. And people can still imagine that, but effectively the magic of painting is sort of up because anybody can, not anybody, if you have access to the right device, you can get something that's better than a painting. So where do you go from here? The Impressionists in the 1860s and 1870s go, well, here's the thing. What if what we paint is not actually what you see, but how you feel when you see it? And so you have this. This is one of the very first Impressionist paintings. This is the one that gives the movement its name, because one of the critics at the time just shredded it, and shredded this painting in particular, calling them impressionists, like, they're just painting what they feel, and like that. Now, Monet is clearly not trying to give you a photorealistic image of this scene. He is painting his impression of the scene. It's even called Impression Soleil Levant, an impression of the rising sun. And you have this, not quite as abstract, but compare it to what came earlier. It's got a lot chunkier brush strokes, and there's more life to it. The other thing that marked off the Impressionists was, instead of painting rousing historical scenes or uplifting revolutionary moments, they just painted stuff. Flowers, people hanging out. You'll notice some of the people here look excited, others are just, there. In the past, if you painted people in a studio, you went for a certain expression. Here, they're just going for any old thing. Just life, right? The idea being that if we're going to base a new movement that responds to all the changes happening around us, let's make it one that just gives us back our individual subjectivity every day. Just the stuff we think and feel when we look around us. So that was the new question. What if what we see isn't really what we see? So what if, in other words, what we see appears different from the way other people see it? What if our emotions, the time of day, the temperature, all actually contribute to sight? Now, once you ask that question, where does it go? Well, we go from Impressionism to what's sort of generally termed Expressionism. Artists like Edvard Munch and Van Gogh, not Van Gogh, sorry about that. Maybe I'll edit that out, maybe I won't. Go, well, if what we're painting is our impressions, why does it have to actually look like a real thing? Like, why does it have to even look sort of photographic? Why can't we just make it clear that people are looking at a painting, so that they're looking at the texture of the paint itself as much as the image? So Cubism, which was the beginning of this lecture, takes the game further and goes, well, that's fine, your impressions are great, but you're only painting from one angle, one side. You're looking at a wall, you're painting that wall. But really, your impressions of a scene are going to have many different angles, so why don't we depict all of those angles? So Cubism is the end game of Impressionism. It's entirely subjective. It's saying we're going to depict all angles at once, all the possible impressions a person can have over time in different places, all together on the canvas, and no one even has to recognize it. So, for example, one of the very first, this is sort of proto-Cubist by Picasso, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, Gentlewomen or the Ladies of Avignon, in 1907. The lady in the middle, you can go, okay, sort of, fine, all right. On the lower right, Negative, no way. If we had time, we could get into the impact of sort of primitive art on Picasso and the early Cubists. I saw an exhibit once in a museum setting some of these paintings alongside masks from Polynesian tribes. The long, real elongated, weird-looking sort of tribal masks, and it was pretty interesting. Anyway, Guernica, 1937. There's a lot of paintings in between, but you get the idea. Here, there's not even any need to have any sort of depth of field. It looks very two-dimensional because Picasso's trying to give you everything he's seeing and feeling at the same time. Now, let's get to Virginia Woolf. That gives you sort of a brief history of Cubism. I'm going to go back here. Of what leads up to Cubism and what Cubism is responding to. A worldview that is incredibly precise, and in response to that scientific precision and what people feel like is the management of their emotions and their thoughts, Cubism, beginning with the Impressionists and going into Cubism, artists go, yeah, we need to reclaim this for ourselves. We need to reclaim a space where we are just who we are. We don't need to be managed by anything. Now, how does something like this, or this, translate into literature? Virginia Woolf is trying to do some of that. One of the things you will notice in the selection I've given you from Mrs. Dalloway is that she is trying to give you essentially many different perspectives all at the same time. So you'll notice sentences kind of run together and they get very confusing and they pile up. Again, that's what this looks like. That's what Guernica looks like. That's what this painting looks like. It's all sorts of angles piled together. Let's read a quick selection here. Bond Street fascinated her. Bond Street early in the morning in the season. Its flags flying, its shops, no splash, no glitter. One roll of tweed in the shop where her father had bought his suits for 50 years. A few pearls. Salmon on an ice block. That is all, she said, looking at the fishmongers. That is all, she repeated, pausing for a moment at the window of a glove shop where, before the war, you could buy almost perfect gloves, and her old Uncle William used to say a lady is known by her shoes and her gloves. He had turned on his bed one morning in the middle of the war. He had said, I have had enough. Gloves and shoes. She had a passion for gloves. But her own daughter, her Elizabeth, cared not a straw for either of them. Okay, this is all over the map. If you read the whole selection I've given you for the week, you'll know she's shopping. But instead of just looking at the street, you just get a barrage of things: flag shops, splash, glitter, tweed in a shop, salmon on an ice block, pearls, etc. Then you get a memory. Then you get something else. Then you get the fact that she likes gloves. It almost feels like someone who's trying to write fully what it would be like to have a novel in ADD version, like just going from topic to topic. There's no reason to settle on them. But again, that's kind of the point. Each of these digressions, when she goes from salmon on an ice block to that is all, it's a little bit like Picasso painting the person on the bottom right. What about an angle that you can't actually even see with your own eyes, right? Mrs. Dalloway is trying to give you every possible angle at once from the perspective of the titular character, Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa Dalloway, in a manner that might be termed literary cubism. So hopefully that helps a little bit with the readings this week. At the very least, you'll have had a chance to look at some, I think, very beautiful art. And we'll see what you make of Virginia Woolf. I like her sometimes and don't like her at other times, so we'll see if you agree.